Hello, welcome to Paris for our latest edition of Talking Europe. We are now 3 years on from the peak of the crisis in Europe over an unprecedented influx of people seeking a new life in the EU. Numbers of arrivals are drastically down at this point, but the political crisis has spun on. Well, today I'm joined by a man who continues to be closely implicated in that story. I'm very pleased to welcome the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, very first question then. You've been in this job since the 1st of January 2016. That was really still amid the peak of this crisis as it was seen here in Europe. What was your experience of coming into this job at that moment?
It was interesting because I've been working with refugees for more than 30 years. And I'm quite used to crisis. In Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, we've had many dramatic refugee crisis. But this was the first time that this crisis somehow came to the rich world, came to Europe, knocked at our doors here. And this provoked a political reaction, which is really the new element in this whole equation.
Well, interestingly, you said recently yourself, there is no refugee crisis in Europe. That's certainly not how it feels to a lot of people here in Europe. But what do you mean by that? How do you assess the situation?
First, I mean that when you take the estimated 68.5 million refugees, displaced people around the world, almost 90% are in poor countries, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, not in Europe. So this is, the refugee crisis is there, not here. But this is not to say that the arrivals of larger numbers of people to Europe, migrants, refugees, doesn't have to be managed. And it has not been managed properly. And this is the crisis element that has sparked the reaction.
Well, before we get into Europe's situation a bit more in the nitty-gritty, I'd just like to bring up one particular world leader, Donald Trump. Recently, he's been in Europe. Now, he's been very critical about how Europe has handled its migration situation. About the UK, it said the UK is losing its culture because of immigration. What impact do you think Donald Trump, as US president, is having on citizens' and politicians' attitudes to migration?
Well, you know, politicians say things that politicians think are good to gain popularity, support, and votes. Now, if you analyze this type of statement, and it's not just Donald Trump, it's many other leaders, you know, there's an element of truth, bad management of this crisis. I think this applies, by the way, also often to the United States. But I think that what I don't like about these statements is that they create an atmosphere, or they give space to an atmosphere of hostility and sometimes even of racism on the part of the general population. That is dangerous.
Some people feel that he is deliberately trying to do Europe down. Do you think that this is a deliberate attempt by Donald Trump?
Well, that's politics, and I am not into politics myself. My only concern, and this is a message that I pass very frankly to leaders, is be careful in stigmatizing people that are moving either because of economic needs. This is also legitimate. But also, and this is my mandate as High Commissioner for Refugees, that are moving because of persecution, war, conflict, violence. These are people that need our protection. They're not a threat. They're victims. So that's what we should not forget.
Now, there are a lot of publicly and rather loudly expressed fears about migration, what people might be bringing into Europe. I think most people watching understand, yes, people fleeing from Syria, they are fleeing war, but there are also loud voices saying this could be bringing insecurity to Europe. What if there are members of ISIS who've managed to get into the refugee flows and they want to come here and attack Europe? Do you feel that these fears are warranted? And what might you say to somebody who does feel that way?
I think that there is no evidence whatsoever that refugee flows per se have brought insecurity. This said, states have a responsibility for the security of their citizens, and therefore we fully support the most thorough screening of people that come into other countries as refugees or as migrants. That's something that it's out of discussion. Of course, that needs to be done. And in fact, we think that sometimes it's not done properly, it's not done thoroughly enough. And we, the humanitarian organizations, are providing advice to governments on how to do it in a principled manner and in an effective manner.
All right, well, let's bring in some specifics now. In recent weeks here in Europe, there has been a sort of a flare-up, a political crisis over migration. NGO ships, including the Aquarius, the MV Lifeline, are struggling to find ports to dock in. Italy and Malta refusing to let them dock there. Do you understand Italy and Malta's position on this? Italy certainly has taken in a huge number of people over the years, and politicians are saying we do not feel that we're being heard.
I think that the recent responses of the Italian government are explained by the fact that for a long time they were on the front line, just like Greece before, and the countries in the Mediterranean are the most exposed to these arrivals. And the problem is really that there has never been sufficient effort on the part of the European states to share that responsibility. But that was perhaps difficult at a time when a lot of people are arriving. This year, less than 50,000 people have crossed the Mediterranean so far, 6 times less than the same period last year, many times less than in 2016. So now is the opportunity to establish a system, to share responsibility and avoid the pressure being put on one state. Closing the ports is not the answer, clearly, and especially weakening rescue at sea is not the answer, cannot be the answer, but we need to look at this structural problem of sharing responsibility.
Just a brief point, when we talk about responsibility, obviously for geographical reasons, there are certain countries that are taking the highest number of people crossing the Mediterranean. They tend to be Greece, Italy and Spain. With this recent situation with Italy, we had a ship going from Italian waters across to Spanish waters. There were some people saying, well, where's France in all of this? Is France shirking its responsibilities? Well,
I think that what the situation needs is a predictable, shared, efficient disembarkation mechanism. And this is what the International Organization for Migration and UNHCR, my organization, have suggested to the Europeans with concrete proposals. And we're working on that. I think at that point, there has to be a shared responsibility for the reception, the screening, and the further follow-up on the people that arrive. That has to be shared because, you know, we are telling the world that refugees are an international responsibility. We're negotiating even a global compact on refugees. If Europe cannot lead by example there, how can we tell other poorer countries to follow the same path?
All right, well, there is work being done in Europe. At the latest EU Council, EU leaders did come up with a new sort of an agreement, parts of an agreement at least, about how to handle migrants. Charlie James has been taking a look at this. She's got an explainer for you on what we know about disembarkation centres that are being talked about by the EU, how they might be set up, how they might work.
France and Italy had already pushed for asylum processing in Africa, but now European leaders have agreed to set up controlled centers for migrants on EU soil. The aim is to ease the burden on southern countries such as Italy, Greece, and Spain, where migrants first arrive by sea and are registered.
The Council promises, along with other EU financial institutions, to help organize the flux of migrants that arrive to Spain, as well as in countries where the migrants transit, such as Morocco.
So far, specific details on the centers are scarce, but the European Council's conclusions did outline the basics. The agreement dictates that migrant screening centers would be voluntary and be used for rapid and secure processing to decide whether or not people are legitimate refugees. And it says the centers would be backed by full EU support. One challenge will be complying with international law. Human rights groups have already criticized European migrant hotspots in Greece and Italy, where they say people face poor living conditions and human rights violations. European leaders also agreed to study setting up similar centers outside Europe, but it is not clear which African countries might agree to them. Tunisia has already refused to be involved, and Libya has rejected the legality of proposed camps on its southern border. So while the agreement is being lauded by EU leaders, there are still many hurdles to clear before these centers are up and running.
There we go. So looking at that idea of these voluntarily set up controlled centres on European soil for handling migrants, I think the key word there perhaps is voluntary. Filippo Grandi, do you believe that we are going to see hands shooting up in Europe to run these?
Not at the moment, but perhaps we need to define better how these centres would work. The essential thing is that they don't become a perpetual place of detention for people. This is what we have to avoid at all cost. So procedures have to be quick, support has to be effective, and everything has to be, the process has to be clear. Maybe if we manage to do that, there will be more takers for this initiative.
Well, indeed, it's not totally clear at the moment what these centres would look like or how they'd operate. There's a question mark about whether they would actually be sort of closed centres, a kind of detention centre. Do you have any more information on that?
No, I don't. Let's not forget, this is not a choice of the United Nations. These are choices that have to be made by states. We advise, of course, that they should not be detention centres. You know, we always say seeking asylum, in particular, is not a crime. Why should you keep somebody in detention for that? However, we do understand that there has to be some form of control for a limited period of time, and this can be done if it is done in the proper manner. Again, it's a very technical matter on which we are advising currently European institutions and states.
Another idea that's come up in recent days from Austria, a proposal to make it so it's no longer possible for asylum to be applied for at all on EU soil. That goes against current EU law, would require a law change. Would you accept that law being changed?
Not at all. I think that the principle of people being able to seek asylum in Europe needs to be absolutely preserved. If we were to lose that principle and the application of that principle, we would be betraying one of the fundamental, one of the foundations of the entire human rights construction in this continent. I don't think that this is what most states will want to see.
All right, we're looking outside the EU. There's also talk about setting up centres in third countries, North Africa being most looked at, also perhaps Albania. The UNHCR would oversee these, according to European leaders. Can you tell us more about what kind of role the UNHCR would be prepared to take on with the information you have?
Well, maybe some leaders have said this. Nothing of this has been decided. Clearly, we are ready to set up centers where people on the move can be examined, can seek asylum. We do this all over the world. So we are ready to do it wherever states agree to host this type of centers. We always go back to this important issue. These are state-led initiatives. So states have to agree on a system, and then to the extent that it is based on principles and to the extent that our help is needed, we will provide it.
Well, there has been pushback about this idea from several North African states, also from rights groups. We had the head of the Greens group at the European Parliament, another voice criticising the idea, essentially saying the proposal goes against people's human rights to have these centres for people wanting to come to the EU, but not on EU soil where EU laws and rights don't apply.
Yes, and this has to be handled with very great caution. Because I would agree with some of those arguments very much. And let's not forget that in the outer belt of Europe, there are states like Libya where there are no human rights, where there are no institutions working properly. So how would you operate this type of structure without having reliable state structures doing it? So we have to be very careful. We have to judge case by case. And this has to be really negotiations between states to which we will, as I said, provide advice.
Now, I know while you're here in Paris, you're also discussing what are termed forgotten crises, the ones that aren't in the headlines. Do you feel that Europe is over-obsessed with this crisis that's happening on its own territory?
Yes, to an extent. I think that we can't talk of a crisis in a continent of 500 million people when the number of people that have crossed the Mediterranean is less than 50,000. I've just come back from Bangladesh, a country that has taken in the last few months 700,000 Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. a country with very limited resources. I visit Africa all the time, where very poor countries, because of geography, are obliged to take in with open borders, millions of people. So I think it is important to put things in perspective. However, to use this period of no crisis, frankly, to set things straight, to reform systems of reception so that next time, if more people come, we're ready for that.
All right, well, just one brief question looking to the future. After all that we've talked about, do you feel optimistic about Europe's chances of fixing this situation, taking that opportunity you just talked about?
Optimistic is a big word in the modern world. But look, I have two reasons for looking ahead with some serenity, let's say. One is that I think in the end it is in the interest of all governments in Europe to fix this and to work together towards fixing it. So that is something that in the long term, when the big political dust has settled, may be possible. And second, and this is very important, look at what happened when the Aquarius, that ship that was refused disembarkation, was wandering in the Mediterranean. When it finally got to Spain, because Spain generously said, come here, look at the outpouring of solidarity on the part of the Spanish people. It means that beyond hostility, beyond politicization, humanity is not dead, and solidarity is still a strong sentiment in the continent of Europe.
All right, Filippo Grandi, we have run out of time, but thank you very much for your thoughts, for being here on France 24.
Thank you very much.
And that's it for this part of Talking Europe. Do stay tuned. More European news coming up for you.
You Are Here, your programme spotlighting French heritage.
Versailles, the Louvre, Mont Saint-Michel are well-known stars of French heritage. But French genius and France harbours many other hidden treasures. The arts, gastronomy, architecture, as well as nature's wonders. Come along with France 24, discover France's living heritage. From young apprentices to accomplished craftsmen and farmers, to Michelin star sporting chefs, meet these people whose passion for their professions preserve and drive French heritage.
You Are Here on France 24 and France24.com.